Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome once again to our fourth and last session of these wonderful Jornadas Boston College, our third session of Jornadas. Welcome, everyone, our students, families, and the whole of our community. Thank you, Analia, for hosting this event, and over to you to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Ivana. Thanks to our students for following us. This is the fourth and last talk of this year's Jornadas Boston College. Thanks again to Martha Crespo, who will be moderating the Q&A session after the presentation, and to Marina Fernandez Crespo for her technical support. And of course, a big welcome and thank you to Anya Leonard, who's gonna share with us today the talk Classics Beyond the Classroom. Do we need ancient history in our modern lives? Anya Leonard is the founder of Classical Wisdom and project director. She has an MA in Sociology from the University of Edinburgh and studied at St. John's College in Annapolis with a double major in philosophy and the history of math of science. She lives and writes from all over the world. Today, Anya is talking from Houston, Texas. Hello, Anya. How are you? Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, thank you. Over to you then.
Okay, well, thank you again for the warm welcome. I am Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. And I'll be talking about ancient history and the classics. Now, I think for a lot of people, when they first hear something like the classics, they think it's going to be boring and not very interesting. So I am going to start you off with something to show exactly how exciting the ancient world is. So I've got a little clip for you, actually, from a very popular video game called Assassin's Creed: The Odyssey, which is extremely historically relevant and correct. So just to give you a little taste of just how exciting the ancient world can actually be. Okay, so that's just a little introduction. But the idea is that the ancient world has got a lot of really fascinating time period and has just a lot of things that are very exciting and maybe more exciting than people initially think. And so there's a lot of elements to the classics, one of which is the ancient history part. And this is a scene from a movie called 300, which is actually a really exciting point in ancient history. Basically, you had the Persian Empire headed by Xerxes coming to do battle and try to take over ancient Greece. And this is a scene from the Battle of Thermopylae, in which this huge, massive Persian army, like 30,000 to maybe 300,000, we don't know, came down and to this tiny little narrow pass. And these 300 Spartans, as well as a few other Greeks, fought them off.
Sorry, Anya, can you please share your screen again? Because we cannot see it anymore.
There you go. Could you see the video before?
Let's see. There. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Were you able to see the video, though? That was fine?
No. No. We couldn't see the video either. So can you rewind a little bit, please? Sorry for that.
No. I'll do it again. Because otherwise it won't be very exciting. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure everyone can see that again, because the really exciting thing about that video game actually is, like I said, the historical accuracy. And they do a really good job of reenacting the ancient Greek world. They use a lot of ancient Greek real historical figures, and they have excellent references to mythology throughout as well. And so back to this movie 300, which is another exciting movie, but not maybe as historically accurate. But the thing is that the actual history is so thrilling that you don't even have to make this stuff up. So I just want to tell you this one very quick scene where Xerxes is coming down with his huge Persian army, and you've only got 300 Spartans that are holding off this invasion, and they managed to hold them off. But when Xerxes first comes down, he's like, I've got such a big army that when we shoot our arrows, we are going to block out the sun. And then Leonidas, the commander of the Spartans, said in reply, then we will do battle in the shade, which is just, such an epic response. And so you could see that there's just this element of grandness and sacrifice, and they were able to, while they all died in the battle, manage to hold off the Persians just long enough so that the ancient Greeks could compile an army and a navy and defend their homeland. But the classical world also involves a lot of mythology, which has the great stories of their original gods, the Olympians and the Titans. We have, on the one hand, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. And we also have, on the other side, Poseidon, the god of the sea. He has his Triton, he causes earthquakes. So it's a very rich mythology with really fascinating stories. And you also have a lot of philosophy and a lot of great contemplation. Here we have a quote from Marcus Aurelius that it was the former Roman emperor who's often considered the philosopher king. He was he's gone down in history as being very instrumental in keeping the concepts of Stoicism alive. And here's a quote from him: "Give thyself time to learn something new and good, and cease to be whirled around." So that's from his book, The Meditations. But the classics, specifically speaking, kind of compose a time period of, I would say, around the 12th century BC to about 3rd century or 4th, 5th century AD, depending on how you want to define the end of antiquity. So this time period, is huge. You think the classics are going to be niche, but actually it spans a long time period. And it also spans a long distance. So here in this, we show you the Greek colonies in the 6th century BC, but the gold mask it's called the Mask of Agamemnon. So that starts with the Mycenaeans in the Minoan time period. So we're really going back, to the 12th century BC. But it expanded all the way to the Roman Empire as well. And the Roman Empire really was huge as well. So the Greeks, they got as far as India during Alexander the Great's empire. And the Romans, you can see, went all the way to the British Isles, went to North Africa. And this region and time period is both huge and extremely multicultural. You had different people interacting from all over the region. You had huge movements. You had huge trade from the Phoenicians to the Romans. It was an extremely diverse population. You have interesting historical figures that come from all different parts of the world, from, like I said, North Africa and England to the Iberian Peninsula, all the way to the Far East. And they all interacted with each other. So they were considered, if you can see here, they were once described as little frogs around a pond. And in that, waterways were really instrumental. And all of these places sort of interacted with each other in a really flourishing of knowledge, of art, literature. And so that you can really see how it evolved around the Mediterranean. Now, people ask, why should you study the classics? Why study ancient history? And that's a very good question. there are many, many good reasons. One of which is it is a really interesting time period in and of itself. There are many, many interesting time periods and different time places, and this one happens to be a particularly interesting one. You have everything from the Colosseum and the gladiators, you have the Roman charioteers, you've got the Greek Olympics, for those who like sport, but of course you have literature, you have philosophy, and there's just so many interesting things that have come out of this quite huge and influential time period. But it's also influential afterwards. For those who might not be familiar with these men, these are the founding fathers of the United States, and they were all huge classics lovers and classicists through and through. In fact, they often wrote to each other back and forth in ancient Greek and in Latin. And at one point, it was proposed that the official language of the United States should be ancient Greek. So that's how much they loved it. You know that the Declaration of Independence was hugely influenced by the philosopher Epicurus. And all of these men got their huge influence in designing sort of the idea of a democracy from ancient Greece as well. But it's more than that, because essentially straight up to the 19th century, to be considered an educated man or an educated woman, you had to be knowledgeable in the classics. And that is that specific time period. The entrance exam for Harvard, for all the Ivy League colleges, was ancient Greek and Latin. And because of this huge influence in education, there are references to the classics throughout history, and especially basically from the actual time period of the classics straight up to the 19th century. So I say, if you want to understand Freud or psychoanalysis or that, you've got to study the classics, because he references Greek mythology extensively. If you want to enjoy walking around art museums and enjoying the paintings of the pre-Raphaelites or Titian or Rubens or any of those guys, you got to study the classics. And if you want to enjoy literature, literature has been hugely influenced again and again and again by the classics. So for those of you who might recognize this gentleman, he's an extremely famous Argentine author who is also a huge classics lover. And just about every single one of his books references a labyrinth. And he specifically was very interested in the concept of the labyrinth, which comes from Greek mythology. And you might recognize this fellow, not Borges, the Minotaur, which is the story of a half-man, half-bull, who was a monster, a very famous Greek monster, who was put into a cage in which he could not escape. And that was actually a maze and a labyrinth, actually invented by the famous mythological inventor Daedalus. And so this was this monster, and Borges wrote a fantastic short story called The House of Asteron, which is a story told from the Minotaur's perspective. So you see classical references everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And once you know about the classics, you will continue to see it everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. You might recognize this building down in Buenos Aires. This is a pretty close mimicry of one of the most famous ancient Greek buildings, the Parthenon. You will find references to classical architecture throughout every major metropolis in the world, especially anything built in the neoclassical time period, which is trying to reference the classical time period. So that is, maybe on the superficial level of seeing references, but also a lot of the ideas and concepts of the ancient Greek and Latin world were steeped in a way of thinking and an analytical method. So there are concepts called like the rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion, how to convince people, how to do what you want to do, which might sound a bit malicious, but it's more than that. It's about having a way and command over language, understanding, debate, and dialectic. And it's very important to also know when people are using it on you. But the rhetoric is just one. You also have logic, you have ethos, ethics. All of these really are ways to develop your critical thinking, and they're tools that will help you in your life no matter what you go into. Whether you're in the sciences, whether you're in the arts, whether you're in anything, being able to use logic to solve problems, use rhetoric to express yourself properly, and to use ethics so you can be a good person and a good citizen and a good member of your family and community are essential. And another point for one of the reasons I love the most about the classics is it connects you to this sort of huge chain of humanity, where you really realize that we're part of a continuous civilization that have been influencing each other and reacting. And it's important to remember that we're part of this grand human experiment, and that it is a continuing conversation, that we are constantly learning from all those who have come before us. And it's always important to remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and that we should know who those giants are and where our histories come from. With studying and learning the past, it's a way that you can understand actually your current situations more, because humans have not changed in thousands of years. We still have the same motivations, we still have the same desires, we still have the same interactions, and you will find again and again the same stories repeat themselves. As Mark Twain famously said, history does not repeat itself, it rhymes. But when you see the same patterns, you can almost predict the future. You can see the rise and falls of empires, you can see the motivations of people in power, and it really helps you to understand where you are in history, in context of all the current events and where we're going. And it's also very humbling. It gives you a really important perspective on where you are in your life and where you want to go. And it's something that I think can bring a lot of comfort and understanding. So the next question is, how do you discover the classics? Now, of course, there are the books, there are the original texts, and you can read the words that were literally written thousands of years ago, which is just fascinating. The important thing to remember when reading the classics is to not necessarily take everything wholesale. It's important to remember that just as the founding fathers in America were continuing a conversation with the classics, we too continue that conversation. So you can be inspired by, you can reject some, you can have everything laid out before you and just take what works, reject what doesn't work. And it's really important to remember that, because there will be things in the classics that you're not going to like, and there's going to be things that you're going to love. And the important thing is to take the good from it. The man who was credited for starting a Renaissance, the actual Italian Renaissance, was a gentleman named Plutarch. And after the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, as defined by Plutarch, when people stopped reading the classics, he brought back almost single-handedly the idea of falling in love with the ancient world again. And that inspired the entire Italian Renaissance. And one thing he used to do is he used to actually write letters to the ancients. So he would write a letter to Cicero, and he would be mad at him, you know? He would yell at him. And then he would write another letter later on, like apologizing for losing his temper. So you could see that the ancient world can really be alive for you, for him, in a way that's very important. And of course, the idea is to read the originals, to read articles about the originals, to read. Reading will move and exercise your brain in a way that other things cannot do. And so it is important to take that time to read and to be inspired, because when you read a text, you will find something that in it that maybe nobody else has ever seen or doesn't speak to someone else. It's going to be your interaction with the books. So it is important to take that time. And it's important to realize how we spend our time. So there is this concept of leisure time, and this isn't being distracted. It's not a passive thing. It's not, you can't say leisure time is just watching a movie, because it needs to be more active. It needs to be something that's very fulfilling and meaningful. And the reality is that right now, for young people, you have more time than you will have later on in your life. And it's important to use that time wisely, because you could use it scrolling on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, and you could spend an hour on that and then afterwards put it down and not have grown as a person at all. In fact, it's proven to do the exact opposite to your brain. Sitting down and reading, however, you take that exact same time and you read, you will come away with a sense of feeling of having done something more meaningful, more rewarding, and ultimately just better for your mind, your brain, your soul. So it is very important that you take time to do meaningful actions with your time. And that doesn't have to be reading. If you're not super into reading, it can be something contemplative like gardening or bird watching. The idea is being very aware and conscious of how you spend your time and what you're spending your time on. So another place in which to discover the classics is to maybe first think about what interests you in the ancient world, because it is a very, very broad category. But whichever place you start, usually one of the first things I tell people to do is read the Odyssey. There is a fantastic translation in English by Emily Wilson. It's a new one. It is extremely readable. It is modern. It is just delicious. You will go through it and the story comes completely alive. I'm not certain the best Spanish translations, but I'm sure your teachers can advise you. But for the English translation, I highly recommend the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey. This is a fantastic place to start for trying to understand the ancient world, because this is basically the first great piece of work of literature of the ancient world. I mean, we're going to go back to Mesopotamia and get the Epic of Gilgamesh and whatnot, but for the classical world, for the Greco-Roman world, it all starts with Homer. And this is a story you probably will recognize elements from anyways. You might have heard of the Cyclops with the big eye. This is a picture in the middle of that scene. You might know of the sirens, the beautiful women luring men off their ships. It is a fantastic tale that works on so many levels, but it's also complete the cornerstone of the Greco-Roman world. Every single ancient would have known lines and lines and lines of the Odyssey, as well as the Iliad. And the Odyssey is so readable. It's a fantastic introduction. But I think if you're into literature, you know, there's also Sappho. It's always good to remember that while Homer was the great poet, Sappho was the great poetess. So she was equally important in the ancient world. Sadly, we do not have many of her works left today, but I just like to always remind people that there was a poetess as well as a poet. If you're interested in history or military history, of course, that's very exciting. This is the Gladiator, a scene from the movie with Russell Crowe. It's another great movie, and there are lots of movies on that time period. So that's another great way to kind of learn a bit more of the classics. But again, if you're interested in the literature, great. If you're interested in the history, great. I know a lot of people who like to reenact war scenes, and they're pretty exciting war scenes. Even as somebody who would not necessarily say military history was my strong point, I found the specifics of like the Peloponnesian War like actually thrilling. Like in which angle there's betrayal, there's like last minute change arounds, there's double actors, it's very thrilling. But there's also the mythology, and this is a great way for people to get into the classics. Here we have an artist's depiction of Medusa, the woman whose head was filled with snakes who would turn anyone into stone. How she became Medusa and what happened to her is a fascinating story, which when you know it, you will see references to it again and again and again, from, you know, Versace bags to architecture to paintings. Everywhere you will see the influence of Medusa and Greek mythology at large. So there are great ways to get into mythology. I know the Percy Jackson novels are very popular, and they've been doing a great job of getting people kind of interested in a lot of the characters. There are lots of great websites and resources. If this is what you're interested in, this is another great way to get into the classics. But there is also philosophy and math. This fellow was a very strange man, but he was also brilliant. So this is Pythagoras. You may recognize the Pythagorean theorem from school. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And this was, you've got a little depiction of it on the piece of paper underneath his hand. The idea that you could come up with a universal formula that will always be true was mind-blowing. And I think it's really exciting if you're into math or science to sort of study the history of math and science. And it can come alive in a way and illuminate those fields in a completely different angle. So if you're more of a visual learner and maybe you don't really enjoy math normally, I would suggest checking out Euclid. If you follow the propositions of Euclid and you come to the end, which is the Pythagorean theorem, you approach it in such a different way than you might traditionally get in a math class these days, where you're sort of told a formula. To understand how the formula was found and discovered in the first place brings the whole world of math and science to light. And it's thrilling to really understand it from a different perspective. So if you're more analytical and you like math and science, the classics are still a fantastic place to go and to study how these ideas came about in the first place. There are lots of really cool resources nowadays for finding the classics. I have a podcast, Classical Wisdom Speaks. If you want to just study the history of ancient Greece, there's a great one called Ancient Greece Declassified. There's History Fangirl. There's so many. There's the Caesars. If you like Rome, the History of Rome with Michael Duncan is a fantastic podcast for that. There are YouTube clips. There are so many cool things nowadays that help you kind of find whichever angle of the classics you find interesting. And last but not least is the philosophy itself. Some of the greatest philosophers of all time were the Greeks, and I think a great way to discover the classics is to discover a way of thinking and approaching the world. And a lot of that starts with asking questions, and asking important questions like, why are we here? Where are we going? But very importantly, how should we live? What makes you be a good person? What is good? What is beauty? You know, these are questions that just by thinking about them, you can delve into the ancient world and you can see sometimes what the ancients thought themselves. It's a great way to get into philosophy itself because the way they ask the questions are intuitive. They're natural. They're questions that I think every person should ask sometime in their life. And there's a very famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And it's true, because once you examine why we're here and what we're doing, you open your mind up to a new way of thinking about things. And Aristotle, one of the most famous Greek philosophers, and the man here quoted, "The pleasures arising from thinking and learning will make us think and learn all the more," really said the key to being happy is to spend your time doing meaningful and virtuous things. And the most meaningful and most virtuous thing is learning for the sake of learning. And I think this is a really important takeaway, that by just thinking about thinking, which is the whole field of metaphysics, thinking about what is knowledge, thinking about what it means to be a human today, will make you, in the very act of thinking of it, a better person and a happier person, genuinely, because our actions are who we are, and our actions start with our thoughts. And if we think about meaningful things, we can make a path to doing a more meaningful life. And I think that is a wonderful takeaway from the classics. And it doesn't, if you're not interested in the specific time period alone, but just the thought of thinking about thinking and goodness and who we should be is more than enough. So with that, I say I welcome any questions you may have about the ancient world, about the classics, about where you can find learning about the classics, and you feel free to add anything in the chat. Yeah, if we have any questions, let me see if I can set up my page a little bit more. Let's see.
Hi, what a nice talk. Thank you so much, Anya. Super interesting. I love the takeaway, thinking about thinking and about who we should be. Yeah, really thought-provoking. Thank you so much. Well, there are a couple of questions here. Can I start shooting?
Of course, go ahead.
All right. One is, there's a person particularly interested in the cinema. So she was wondering about what other popular films you could suggest besides the Gladiator.
Yes, there are more and more series happening right now. Again, depending if you're interested in history specifically, Greece specifically, Rome, or mythology. There was a BBC series on Rome that was a very long series. It is quite cool because it starts off with two gentlemen, and they're both like lowly soldiers, but actually the character is based on a real life person. So that we have journals from. There are plenty of things on Caesar. Another great way that I think is interesting to get into the Roman and Greek world is with Cleopatra. There's plenty of movies about Cleopatra. And she, just so people know, she was actually a Greek. And she was the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt. And she actually spoke 9 languages, and she was the first of all of the Greek pharaohs to actually learn ancient Egyptian. And so her whole iconography was based on incorporating herself, and she was a fantastic leader. So things on Cleopatra, yes, the movie 300, there was a follow-up movie on 300. There are funny ones as well. There's like old musical called Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is like a hilarious classic. But I could put together like a list of good movies and TV shows because there are so many, in fact.
Yeah, and your podcast and the others you mentioned, that would be great, really.
No, of course. Yeah.
I would really appreciate it. So Theo says, history is interesting, but do you think it should be taught at school, or should it only be taught for those who are really keen on it and want to study it?
Well, I think some basic history is always helpful, because if you don't know where we've come from, it's really hard to understand anything. And as I was saying before, like so many references of what you're learning. Okay, say you're just interested in math. I mean, the history of math is essential in understanding math as well. So the tricky thing, of course, is that there are so many histories to learn, and so many fascinating histories. If you're into Chinese history, it is a deep and fantastic history as well. You know, there's been very interesting histories throughout South America and Central America, throughout Africa. I think learning some history, no matter what history fascinates you, is a very important psychological and social exercise, because I think it will allow you to think about history and where we are in it differently. And as I said before, I think it's very humbling to remember that we are part of a greater humanity and where we are in it. And I think sometimes our lives, it's so easy to get caught up in distractions, in ourselves, in really superficial things, and opening up our minds to remember that this great world around us and past, I think is very, very important. It doesn't have to be Greco-Roman, if you're interested in a different time period, but I think some exploration of history is very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And indeed, it is important. Somebody asked, who is your favorite among classics?
Ooh, now that is tricky. I mentioned before, I have a soft spot for Sappho because she was so influential in her ancient time period, and her poetry is very beautiful. And like I said, I've also got a soft spot for Cleopatra because
Yes.
she's so cool. I really like Heraclitus. He was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and the pre-Socratic philosophers, they're the ones who came before Socrates. They were doing some really cool stuff that people didn't figure out again for like thousands of years later. So you have people figuring out you know, about the world being round and astronomy. You had a pre-Socratic philosopher called Democritus who basically came up with atomic theory in the 6th century BC, which I just think is just mind-blowing to know how much we've known. But I think also there's some great, if you're into history, Xenophon writes, you know, the ancient historians were pretty impressive people in themselves. They were usually like Xenophon himself led back a band of 300 assassins across Persia as he was escaping, and you know, was this great military conqueror, and then became a historian. So same thing with the playwright Aeschylus. He saw himself as a great warrior, and then also wrote plays on top of that. So you really get the concept of a Renaissance man or woman where you can be good at many things, and that they all kind of combine to make you a more interesting person.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so versatile, right? All right. There is another question about whether there is any connection between the Greeks and the Vikings.
Not really. So the Vikings were about 1000 AD, and you know, the height of the Greek time period, we're looking more like 3rd, 5th century BC. So, you know, there's quite a time difference. You did have a lot of interaction with the barbarians to the north, and the Roman Empire. In fact, in the ancient Roman time period, you know, a slave could be someone from any background and any wealth. You could be rich and become a slave. You could be poor, become a slave. You could be from any place in the whole Roman Empire and become a slave. If there was ever a correlation between race and slavery, it was if you were redheaded, you were maybe more likely to be a slave because you would have been from the conquered barbarians to the north in Germany and France. But there is some more recent evidence to show that the Vikings traveled much further into Russia. and had interactions with the ethnic peoples in those areas, but not with the Greeks so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You said that humans have not changed much. Would you say that we have not improved in any way?
This is always an interesting question. I don't think we've improved as much as we like to think we have.
Mm-hmm.
And that really history is historical and cyclical. And so, for instance, you read the Odyssey and, maybe right now, for instance, we say, okay, women's rights are way better than they were in the ancient times. Obviously, that's a clear indication of improvement. And perhaps that's somewhat true depending on where you are when you are in history. But like, you go back to the Odyssey and the only purely good character in the whole book is Penelope, the queen. The respect shown to women in archaic Greece was much, much higher than in classical Greece. So at different time periods, we have evolved and de-evolved and evolved and de-evolved. And there are certain aspects which I say are clear improvements. Medicine, surely, would be a perfect example. However, with medicine, we can't progress if we don't take into account ethics. And we need to, technology in and of itself isn't a good thing unless we take time to consider it. So I think that's something that we can learn from the ancient world even today. There's some things in which being contemplative about these sort of things, I think maybe they even did better than us. So it depends on the realm. I mean, I wouldn't want to give birth a couple thousand years ago, but
yeah, because somebody was wondering about what health and hygiene might have been like then.
So, in the Greco-Roman world, they actually had some places where they had very high level of hygiene and lifestyle. A lot of the great thinkers and philosophers lived until their 90s. And so, the worst time period to be alive was after the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's when things really regressed. But during the peak of it, they had much healthier diets, they had much healthier lifestyles. They did have a pretty high level of hygiene. They did do things differently. For instance, you didn't really necessarily take showers with water the same way. I mean, they had baths and stuff. But what they used to do is they used to rub their bodies down with oil. And then they took this metal thing called a scapula and they would scrape the excess oil and dirt off. And that's how they clean themselves, which is a very different tactic. But medicine, ancient Egypt had extremely developed medicine. They did brain surgeries, heart surgeries, things like that. The early Greeks learned a lot from them. At certain time periods, yes, you would go to a temple of Aeschylus and worship him to try to heal. But other times, they did increase the medicine. Interestingly enough, they found that they had basically handicapped ramps for people to get to these temples. So the concept that people were aware of being disabled friendly in medical situations, it was there. There's a great story, if I may just tell very quickly, of Agnosi. She was the first female physician. And she was very worried about women and children dying in childbirth. So she wanted to study medicine. And at that time, only men could study medicine. So she disguised herself as a man and went over to Egypt to study medicine. And she comes back to Athens and still dressed up as a man. She hears a woman screaming in labor and she runs in to help her. But at this time, men and women, women were not comfortable with men being doctors. So the woman in labor said, please go away. And Agnosi says, no, I'm actually a woman. And so she successfully keeps the woman alive and the baby. And the woman is so happy with agnosi, she advises all of her friends to go. And then the male doctors start getting really suspicious of this one doctor who's getting hired by everybody. And they bring agnosi to court to charge her with seducing the women. That's why they think, you know, he is so popular as a doctor. And she says, she bares her breast and says, no, actually, I'm a woman. That's why I've been so popular. And then the men go, oh, no, a woman, you're not supposed to be a doctor. We have to punish you by death. And at this moment, all of the citizen wives come into the courtroom and say, no, this female doctor has saved our lives and we're your wives. You must do what we say. So agnosi was released and could continue working as long as she just worked with women. So that's you see there was more development than I think we think there was, but they still had restrictions.
Lovely story, by the way. Thank you for sharing it. Guadalupe wants to know if you think that new classics can be born nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, there has definitely been, I think, an increase in interest again with mythology and a lot of these classics. I think there is time periods where the classics come back into interest, the Renaissance being a very big one, neoclassicism and the Enlightenment being one. When people rejuvenate their interest in the classics, there's usually a huge boom culturally, scientifically. So I do hope so. I hope that we're kind of on the beginning of people finding that there are a lot of difficulties and things to be worried about in the world right now, and that going back in history we can find perspective and comfort and solutions of what people have done before us. So this is a very good moment, I think, in history to look back and learn from what people have already done. We don't need to make all the mistakes twice.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
All right. Somebody wants to know if Game of Thrones was inspired in the classics in any ways.
I think Game of Thrones, it is definitely more ancient history, but it would be more northern, probably closer to the Vikings or the tribes of the Gaulish people or the German ancestors. So it's a bit more northern in history, but that's a fascinating history as well, of course, and a lot of the medieval time period after the fall of the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire were also interesting time periods to explore and learn about, but a bit later than the classics.
I would like to know if you use video games as triggers when you start a lesson, if you have ever done this, or what kind of triggers do you use to get your classes started?
Well, I normally work with older people, to be honest. So most of my readers are retirees. So video games are probably less of that target audience than the folks I'm talking to today. But I have spoken to a lot of podcasters who volunteer at local high schools and things like that to help teach the classics. And they often use Assassin's Creed, the one I showed, because it's so historically accurate and it's a good way to kind of get into the spirit of being enthusiastic about the ancient world. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend, I don't know how violent the game is. I don't play video games myself, so I don't want to be like on record for saying specifically, but you can, for instance, if you Google YouTube, like a tour of ancient Athens done by Assassin's Creed, they take you on a tour of the city and it's beautifully done and very, very accurate. So you can still enjoy like the video clips of the basically like amazing graphics to kind of get a feel for the ancient world.
Thank you for that tip. There is one more question. How did historians and anthropologists reconstruct the information they found out about health, education, politics?
Well, we have, there's always different types of evidence. there's literary evidence and there's archaeological evidence, and those are probably your two biggest things. You know you're doing well when the literary and the archaeological ones overlap and they're the same. We have still lots and lots of information. Well, the ancient Greeks and Romans recorded everything. They wrote everything. And people like Aristotle were very analytical. Aristotle used to like just writing lists of everything around him. He would write about animals. He was like a biologist. He'd write about theater and poetics and describe that. You know, he would write about politics. He would write about ethics. You know, so we have scrolls and scrolls and scrolls and scrolls and scrolls that tell us about the ancient world. And then we also have, again, archaeological evidence. You would have schools. We know about the entire school setup of how classes were formed in the Roman time period, depending on your economic and social background. We would have all sorts of information that we can go. So there is a lot. What's really cool, actually, is that we're still discovering more all the time, in a way that I don't think people realize how much discovery is happening. So there's two main sources for brand new information about the ancient world. One is a gigantic Egyptian trash heap. It's a dump, literally a dump that has been preserved perfectly in the sand. So I said before, we only have 1 or 2 Sappho poems. Actually, we found almost a complete Sappho poem only in 2014, when basically the ancient Roman Egyptians used to pack up their things with like leftover paper, like the same we do with newspapers.
Yeah.
And they stuff it and do all that stuff. And those papers survived thousands of years in the dry Egyptian desert. So in this trash heap, we're still taking out pieces of paper of original papyrus written thousands of years ago and getting new pieces of information. So it's pretty thrilling. Another one is Pompeii. I'm sure people have an understanding of Mount Vesuvius covering the town of Pompeii. For the 80s and the 90s, they were very worried about the archaeological site and keeping it stable with water levels. So they didn't do any excavations. And they've only started doing new excavations again very recently, like in the last year or so. And they are finding cool stuff. So for instance, they found recently a fast food stand, an ancient Roman fast food stand, because just like us, you know, maybe they need to get a poncho on the street, you know? So there's a lot of cool things we're still learning about the ancient world right now, just through what people have written and what we can actually find and dig out of the ground.
How wonderful. Thank you so much, Anya. Really, highly, highly enjoyable. Thanks for the treat.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Anya. A very enlightening talk. I'm sure students have enjoyed it a lot. You know that now they will be completing an exit ticket. After each talk, they complete an exit ticket and they think about one thing they have learned, things they can put into practice. So then we're going to share with you their feedback. Okay?
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about the ancient world. So I hope everybody enjoyed listening.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Martha. Thanks, Marina, Ivana, and thanks to our students who have been paying attention and asking questions. And happy holidays, everyone. Goodbye.